Pat Brown, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you making the trip out here. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. You've got a big vision and a huge mission that I applaud, and I'm looking forward to hearing all about it. Before we even get into it, though, I have to say that I didn't realize until I started digging in, doing some research for this today, that a few months ago you hired Dennis Woodside as your president.
A rival?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Dennis, I've known Dennis since like 1993.
Oh, man.
We were summer associates at a law firm in San Francisco way back in the day, and have remained friends over the years. And I remember working with him very vividly, and I was just struck with how smart and capable this guy was at a very young age, and somebody who demonstrated incredible leadership skills. Even in this junior position, we were paired together to work on a few matters, and he just took total control of the situation in a way that I've never seen in anybody else. So I knew way back then that this guy was destined for big things. And, you know, he's been at Google running the Motorola division, and then he was at Dropbox as COO, and now he's with you, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, we're so happy to have him. I mean, he's already made a huge impact. He's a terrific leader, complete straight shooter, you know, no BS.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just a great guy.
He is super smart, and also an incredible Ironman. You know that, right? He's done like 14 Ironmans or something like that.
Yeah, I know. I haven't followed his career, but I've heard that since. Yeah.
Cool. So I think the best way to...
He was just out training yesterday. So
was he?
Watch your back.
Oh, yeah. Trust me. I think he went like 9:22 in an Ironman, I think. He's super fast. He's a very good athlete.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the mission statement, the why behind Impossible Foods.
Sure. Well, the mission is very simple. It's to completely replace animals in the food system by 2035. And the why, I'll try to keep it as short as possible, but basically, you know, I got on the path to founding it when I realized what I should have known earlier, and which I did, that the use of animals as a food technology is by a huge margin the most destructive technology on Earth, and really poses a catastrophic threat. And I thought I was pretty savvy about environmental issues, and, you know, I had been on a plant-based diet for a long time, so I had no particular investment in that business. But it really came as a surprise to me when I started looking for a problem to work on, just trying to figure out what's the biggest problem that I can contribute to solving. What a humongous, disastrous impact that technology has. It's, I think, as most people know, it's a major source of greenhouse gases, more than all forms of transportation combined. It is the biggest user of fresh water in the world, the biggest polluter by far of fresh water in the world. And the biggest issue is that it occupies a huge land area for land-based agriculture. About 50% of the entire land surface of Earth is actively in use right now, either growing feed crops or grazing livestock. And that land footprint comes at the expense of all the biodiversity that previously occupied that land. And as a result, it is, by an overwhelming margin, the biggest cause of this catastrophic meltdown in biodiversity we're experiencing. For all practical purposes, nothing else really matters. It's land-based animal agriculture and overfishing that are causing this thing. And that is even more of a, I think, risk to the future of our planet than the climate change issue. And I think people are increasingly starting to become aware of it. But, you know, in the past 40 years, we've basically wiped out half the wild animals that were living on Earth back then. And it's just across the board: mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, even insects. And that has happened so fast, and it's happening. It's continuing to accelerate because the driver is the land footprint of animal agriculture and overfishing, which are the demand for meat and fish is growing faster than population. And when you take pieces of an ecosystem out of the ecosystem, it's like pulling bricks out of a wall. It's extremely destabilizing and basically won't immediately cause, but is setting up for a crash. And so I don't think we've even begun to feel the full impacts of this problem. But anyway, blah 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 blah. When I realized this, I felt that okay, this is what I've got to work on. And I also realized that very quickly that you're not going to solve the problem by asking people to change their diets, telling them to change their diets, educating them, coercing them, anything like that. It's never worked. It's been tried every which way.
Yeah, I'm still trying though.
There's no reason not to try.
Yeah, but I hear you. I think you're absolutely right. You have to solve this problem you have to meet people where they are.
Exactly. You have to meet people where they are. And China, which is used to getting what it wants when it asks its citizens for something, asked its citizens to reduce their meat and dairy consumption by half. This was 2 or 3 years ago. And what happened was absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. The demand didn't go down. It kept going up.
Yeah, it's going up. Well, the rise of the middle class there is contributing to that. And I think Asia accounts for something like 46% of all meat consumption.
Yeah, Asia as a continent, absolutely. And it's Asia and Africa are where most of the growth is happening. Asia in particular because of the big population. So that's a big target for us. But I think the real take-home message, though, is that yes, I was in education for most of my life. I'm all for education, and I think it's very important for people to, understand what's going on in the world. But the people who understand this problem the most, I was at the COP21 climate conference like 3 years ago, and you have hundreds of the most dedicated environmentalists in the world at this event, and literally almost to a person, they went out and had steak for dinner.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that pretty much tells you that knowing about the issue, caring about the issue, is still not enough to get people to change what they love in their diet. And so what that meant for me is that the only way to solve it is to basically frame it as a technology problem. The world is going to continue to demand these foods, but we're making them the wrong way, using incredibly inefficient and obviously quite destructive technology that underperforms in every way that matters, including economics. So because it's so inefficient, on a nutritional basis, the foods we get from animals are more than an order of magnitude more expensive than any plant-based equivalent. That's a huge opportunity to come up with a new technology that outperforms in every way that matters to consumers. Most importantly, deliciousness, but also nutritional value, affordability, and so forth. And I was sure that's completely doable back then, and I'm even more sure now.
Right.
So that's how we're going to solve the problem.
Right. So here we are. I mean, the disconnect and the dissonance is huge when you look at the statistics. As you said, something like 50% of all arable land on the planet is devoted to animal agriculture in some respect. And
a very large fraction of the non-arable land is heavily grazed.
Right. Yeah. 14.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to animal agriculture, which is basically on parity, if not exceeding transportation, which is what everyone wants to talk about. But the mass species extinction is something that you don't hear that much about. And truly, like 50% of our species have gone extinct in like the last 50 years or something like that.
Well, it's not, just to correct that, it's not species extinction, it's the total number of individual wild animals pretty much across the board,
okay.
mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, is down by more than 50%. But it's a precursor to species extinction. Basically, you reduce the populations, they become more and more unstable. And once you get to a certain size, basically they're, just on a slippery slope to extinction.
You pass a threshold and then you can't come back from that. And when you look, it becomes evident when you kind of look at what's going on in the Amazonian rainforest, right, where we're decimating these, beautiful ecosystems at the rate of like 1 football field a minute or something like that. And that's all going towards cattle grazing and clearing land to raise crops for these cows, pretty much, right? I heard you talk about the biomass of cows alone, like exceeding every other animal on the planet by some ridiculous number.
Tenfold.
Tenfold, right?
Yeah, and the biomass, so, and that's, I think, just a striking symbol, you could almost say, of how out of control this system is. That the dominant species by biomass, overwhelmingly on Earth's land surface, is cows. And it's completely consistent. I think if you, a lot of people say, how could that possibly be? And all you have to do is think, okay, when was the last time I drove any distance? It doesn't matter where you are in the world. What animals did you see? Cows, the occasional sheep, a squirrel maybe, a crow, more cows.
You'd probably see pigs and chickens, but they're all inside, these CAFOs where you can't actually see them.
That's actually a very good point. So the pigs on Earth today outweigh every remaining wild animal on land by more than a factor of 2.
It's crazy.
The pigs outweigh them all.
Yeah.
And you're right. We don't see a lot of them wandering around because they're in CAFOs. And chickens outweigh every remaining wild bird by more than a factor of 2. So, it's
completely out of whack. Yeah. All right. Well, you're a very unlikely entrepreneur. You come from this academic background. You had a very, nice situation all set up for you at Stanford, where you were a tenured professor in biochemistry and genomics, right? And you were somebody who had been vegetarian, at least, or plant-based for some number of years. You got interested in the environment. And you decided to take this sabbatical. So I'm interested. It's a very interesting journey to get you to impossible, like this evolution in your thinking to how you arrived at this point. So walk me through that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was looking for something new to work on. I just wanted to start with a blank slate. And that's one of the great things about the job I had at Stanford is I could pretty much do anything constructive that I wanted, and I wanted to pick the most important problem I could work on. As I said, it very quickly became clear that this is not just the most important problem I could work on; it's overwhelmingly the most important and urgent problem in the world. And once I realized that, I spent some time thinking about how to do it. I made one false start, which is that the first thing I did was I organized a conference where I wanted to bring together economists and environmentalists and food security experts and so forth to just look at the hypothetical scenario in which the entire food system is plant-based. And the question is, what are the economic impacts, locally and globally? What are the environmental impacts? What are the food security impacts? What are the public health impacts? And I organized it kind of, bringing people with no preconceived notions, but with pretty high confidence that the answer was going to come out. It's a win-win-win-win-win on every axis, and that would persuade policymakers that this is something to try to achieve. Well, then I came to my senses, and I realized that, abundant evidence that a policy change would be good for the world, rarely makes it happen.
Right.
And we don't have time.
It's so disappointing.
Yeah. I mean, just look at all the things we need to do to avoid a climate catastrophe, and I think even, at this point, most people in the world, including most politicians in the world, acknowledge that this is a very real, serious threat, and yet
we can't marshal the political will to even make tiny steps towards the solution.
Yeah. So anyway, the point being that I did this kind of academic thing of, bringing a bunch of people together to kind of look at the issues, and then I realized that was a complete waste of time, and that the only way to change it basically is to accept that policies aren't going to change fast enough. People's food preferences aren't going to change fast enough, if at all. We need to find a way to meet the huge demand for these foods with a much lower environmental footprint and compete in the marketplace and basically make these destructive industries go away, not by attacking them, but by beating them in the marketplace, the good old-fashioned American capitalist way.
What's interesting about the journey that you then embarked on is rather than just trying to come up with a plant-based alternative that tastes good, you took a very, biochemistry approach to solving a very hard problem. The hard problem being, what makes meat taste like meat? Like, what is it inherent in this food that we as a culture embrace and love that creates that that craving or that desire to continue to eat it? Like really getting into the minutia and the building blocks of this product to understand it at a cellular level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that the starting point was realizing that, there have been for millennia, basically, or at least for centuries, plant-based foods that are intended to approximate meats, okay? But they do, by and large, kind of nice try, but a pretty crappy job of it. And it's just not going to work. You're not going to, if you're competing for meat lovers who are not looking for an alternative, those foods are good enough for someone who's looking for an alternative, or someone on a vegetarian diet that wants something vaguely meat-like. We need to outperform meat from animals in every way that matters to meat lovers. And I knew we just don't know how to do this. Mm-hmm. And we don't really understand what is the kind of molecular, biochemical basis of the craveability of meat. But it's an answerable question. And I felt like it's actually an easier question to answer than a lot of the kind of big medical problems that I was involved in working on and others are involved in working on. Because basically, the things that we eat as meat are incredibly complicated as biological systems. But as food, like it may have started as a muscle tissue, doesn't need to move, doesn't need to produce energy from simple nutrients, doesn't need to keep the cell membrane potentials active and all the kinds of things that a tissue does. It just needs to do a few simple things that are producing the flavor that consumers love and the textural properties. And I felt like that's a hard problem. I felt it's a hard scientific problem. We need the best scientists we can possibly hire, but it's the most important scientific question in the world. And I still believe the question, why does meat taste delicious, in molecular terms, is by far the most important scientific question in the world right now. Because if we can answer it and use that knowledge to make the most delicious, craveable meat products in the world using more sustainable ingredients, we can save the world from a environmental catastrophe that we're headed toward right now. So, and actually scientists get that. And so when it came to recruiting scientists, we've been incredibly successful in recruiting awesome scientists, because the way you recruit a great scientist is give them a really important problem that's really challenging. And the best scientists in the world just, gravitate toward that. Right. So we put together...
I think you have 100 out of 330 employees or something like that?
Yes, we have about 110 people in our R&D team. We're actually just about to start hiring a bunch more people to roughly double the size of the team. And so if you're a scientist and want to work on the most important scientific problem in the world, and
email
most urgent,
Pat directly.
Yeah, you know where to go.
So the beginnings of trying to answer this question, how does that work?
Well, there are different attributes that have different molecular bases in meat, but focusing on the one that I think is that most uniquely separates meat from any plant-based foods is the flavor and aroma profile. That based on the flavor and aroma profile, irrespective of texture, whether it's just ground up into a mush or however you want it, and irrespective of what species it comes from, you will recognize as being meat and not a plant. Mm-hmm. And so that was a really important question. And I had a hypothesis as to what might be important for that could have proven wrong. But basically the premise was, it's based on an observation actually, that when you cook meat, something magical happens that never happens with plants or a veggie burger or anything like that, which is that there's this dramatic transformation of the flavor and aroma profile. It goes from being something very mild, flavored with almost no aroma, to something that is has a potent, cooked meat flavor and all the aromas that come with it. And that, and nothing like that happens with a plant. I mean, you cook broccoli, it gets warmer and mushier and maybe a little caramelized or something like that. But meat as a category does something magical. And that suggested that there was a catalyst that's catalyzing the chemical reactions that happen during cooking that produce this explosion of aroma and flavor. And one of the best biological catalysts known is heme. And animal tissues categorically have a lot higher heme concentrations than almost any plant tissue, like 100 or 1,000 times higher concentration. So a potent catalyst, super abundant in the things we call meat, was, a suspect. And our R&D team, we immediately started working on heme on day one, basically, because it was a suspect. But our R&D team did some experiments over the first few months that very clearly established that heme is the magic ingredient that takes simple nutrients that are just like the things that you would find in vegetable broth, amino acids, vitamins, sugars, and fats. Throw in heme, and instead of a mild brothy taste, you get meat.
Mm-hmm. And heme is what binds to oxygen in our red blood cells and carries oxygen to our respective organs, et cetera. It's what makes red blood cells red.
Yes.
And I think it would come as a surprise to a lot of people to discover that heme actually also exists in the plant kingdom.
Yes.
Because we just associate it so heavily with meat products.
Yeah, absolutely. And you associate, it's got a very distinctive red color. You don't see that almost anywhere in plants. But yeah, every plant cell and every cell pretty much on Earth requires heme because it's part of the system that cells use to burn sugars and simple things for energy, to react them without, it's a downstream part of that. But basically it's part of the system that generates energy for the cell. And so it's, for example, the reason that cyanide will kill you in 2 minutes is that it binds to heme and shuts down those pathways that the cell depends on for energy. So yeah, it's ubiquitous in nature. It's one of the most important molecules on Earth, but nobody thinks about it in plants. It happened that there was a particular part of legumes, the part that fixes nitrogen, called root nodules, that is the one plant tissue that really has a high concentration of heme. And that's because the nitrogen fixation kind of chemistry is sensitive to oxygen concentration, so they have to be buffered. And I knew that, and so I actually, in the first about year of the company's existence, I spent a very large fraction of the money that we had raised to start the company, trying every which way to figure out how to harvest root nodules and extract the heme protein from the root nodules. And was really the single major effort in the company. And it basically was a dead end. It got us enough of this heme protein, like hemoglobin, that we could do the experiments to prove that it could generate the meaty flavors and so forth. But it was never going to be scalable or economical. And I use this as an example to people in the company of, you've given our mission and the hugeness of it and all the problems we need to solve to achieve it, where we don't know the answer, we don't know the route, we have to do a lot of things that are risky. Mm-hmm. If you know the answer, it's not an experiment.
Right.
And we have to be quite fearless about it and not talk ourselves out of what seems like a good experiment or a good project just because it might fail. Because any good experiment might fail. If they're not failing a pretty decent fraction of the time, you're not bold enough at all. You're not doing any really interesting stuff. So I remind people of that because it's really important for people not to be afraid to take on something that could even be expensive. We spent, like half the money that we started out with pursuing this idea. Path. It was my idea, yeah. So I can acknowledge that it's a bad idea without hurting anyone's feelings on something that ultimately failed. And it won't be the last time.
And it failed because extracting an adequate amount of heme from this root nodule in legumes became too cost intensive or labor. It was
multiple things.
Too difficult.
First of all, the root nodules inconveniently live underground. Okay, so I thought I'd done a calculation that the U.S. soybean crop in the root nodules contains more heme than all the meat consumed in the U.S. Uh-huh. And that, I think, calculation was correct. The only problem is that it's a very inconvenient place for that stuff to live because you have to dig up the soil. These things are loosely adherent to the roots of the soybean plant, so you have to it's kind of a fragile system. Now when you do that, you have a bunch of dirt with the root nodules embedded in it. And you have to separate out the root nodules in order for it to be food safe. And then you have to biochemically purify the heme protein, and you concatenate all those steps, and it basically becomes extremely difficult to scale and expensive. On top of which, from an environmental standpoint, it's not a good idea to be turning over the soil because it releases carbon stored in the soil and so forth. So there were a bunch of reasons why, I ultimately came to the conclusion that this was not a good idea. And so we moved to producing it by fermentation. And that's how we produce it now.
Right. So it's through a genetically modified yeast, correct? Is that how it works?
Yeah. So basically, I knew that we could produce it by fermentation by just introducing the gene for this plant protein into some organism like yeast. It wasn't clear how economical it would be, just that it would certainly be more economical than digging these root nodules out of the ground. And so we pursued that route, and we then one interesting thing that opened up is that, well, we don't need to just use soy like hemoglobin. We can just look at all the interesting heme proteins that we know of and try a bunch of them. Because given this approach, it's basically just we can pop the gene in for whatever heme protein seems the best and produce a lot of that for our use. And we looked at 36 different heme proteins from everything from paramecium to mung bean to barley, bovine myoglobin, which is the heme protein that's in beef, etc. And what we were optimizing for was the one that performed best in food. And people often say, well, why didn't you just use bovine myoglobin? Well, the cow did not evolve to be delicious, did not evolve to be food, okay?
Right.
Evolution was not optimizing the cow for, or team protein for performance in food. And it's really not very good for that purpose. It oxidizes very readily. It's got a narrower solubility range and so forth. So ultimately, after looking at a bunch of heme proteins, including one that I loved, although it was never going to be good for food, that was a vivid fuchsia color. So it was like unbelievably beautiful to look at, but no one would probably want to eat it. And we arrived at soy-like hemoglobin, which is the same thing we'd been looking at as really the best one from a food standpoint. And so we put the soy-like hemoglobin gene into yeast, and that enabled us to produce it at very large scale.
Right. So you don't have to till the soil in the same way, and it doesn't involve that kind of labor intensity.
Yes, exactly.
A different kind of labor intensity.
And it's actually a safer way to produce it, because we use an organism that's already been well studied for its safety for use in food. It's actually even used as to produce some protein-based drugs for therapeutic purposes and so forth. So the FDA and the regulatory agencies, have already kind of scrutinized it and basically know this is a safe system. Whereas a root nodule, who knows what's in there? Mm-hmm. So there's more question marks. The other thing is that the yeast have their own system for producing heme. They make their own heme, and the heme itself, which is a small molecule, a cofactor, it's a little nugget of a molecule that's held by the protein, which keeps it soluble and sort of protects it against off reactions and so forth. Yeast makes its own heme. And so in terms of heme production, all we did was we kind of amplified up its own genetic system for producing heme, and then gave it this soybean protein to hold on to the heme.
So are the nodules themselves red, or is it just because the heme is in such low concentrations that these plants that have heme in them don't appear to be red?
No, actually, the nodules are vivid red.
Oh, they are?
Yeah, you cut open a root nodule in sort of early summer when the peak growth of the soybean plant. You cut it open, and it looks like you just cut open a steak. I could show you pictures of it. Literally, you take a close-up of it, you might mistake it for a freshly sliced steak.
Oh, wow.
But no other part of the plant has that kind of high concentration. And which is why it was so tantalizing to me, because you look at these things. When I first realized that we needed a heme protein, well, I didn't realize then that we needed it, but I was kind of suspicious that we would. I looked at literally one of the very first things I did on this project was I pulled up some clovers from a little hill that's in my neighborhood, and pulled up a bunch of them, and then just cut up the root nodules, basically just because I wanted to see for myself, is there really a lot of heme in there? And they're bright pink.
Wow.
And so it was very tantalizing to me that, oh man, these things are like practically for free because no one's using them for anything.
Yeah. It hadn't even occurred to anyone to even look in that direction.
There are actually, it's interesting, there are soybean farmers who've been growing soybeans their whole life that have no idea that they're bright red on the inside.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So you figure out this heme thing, and then how do you figure out the rest of what ultimately becomes the Impossible Burger, the other ingredients to create that kind of texture and the way that it cooks and the aroma and everything else that is necessary for you to deliver on your promise?
Well, we're still in the process of we're still trying to understand how meat works better and better all the time. But we knew relatively early on some of the features of the proteins responsible for texture that we needed to match. So we don't need to use identical proteins. There's nothing, the proteins in muscle tissue, again, they didn't evolve to produce any particular texture or juiciness. It's just an incidental property that when you cook them, which they didn't evolve to be cooked, they undergo a textural transformation and they leak some juice and stuff like that. So we sort of understood by studying meat, we understood what were the salient kind of biophysical properties of a protein that we needed, to produce those characteristics, the textural change with cooking, the juiciness,
the binding,
the chewiness, yes, the cohesion. And then fats, there are also things about the fats that are important to understand, because the fats are important for mouthfeel. They're important for the cooking properties, because the melting fat contributes to the cooking and the kind of like, bubbling, so to speak,
right.
Kind of disperses the aromas and so forth. And because most of the flavor molecules that confer meaty flavor are fat soluble, it literally is kind of a delivery system for those molecules to produce the taste. So, but you've got to tune it right. You can't just use any random fat to get those properties right. So anyway, there are a bunch of properties that we, identified that were important, and then needed to find a plant-based way to match them.
So you're using potato, right, and coconut oil are the other two main things?
Coconut and sunflower oil. I think I'd have to look roughly equivalent amounts. So the sunflower oil contains a lot of unsaturated fats, and they participate in the flavor chemistry. The coconut oil modulates the melting temperature, which is important for mouthfeel and some of the cooking behavior. The potato protein is there because of a textural property that it confers. So we, not just any random protein will match the characteristics that we need. So we searched a lot of plant proteins to find the right ones.
Right.
Found the potato protein. We found some others, but the potato protein there was a readily available supply chain for. We actually found some other proteins that, from a performance standpoint and in many ways, are better, but there didn't exist a supply chain for them. We're actually in the process of trying to create a supply chain for some of those better plant proteins that are potentially more scalable and actually better performing.
So this is a process of constant iteration.
This is the decisive advantage that we have over the incumbent technology. It's that the cow stopped getting better at what it's doing, a million years ago, and we get better every single day. And when we can make a product, whatever product, that's as good as the best version that ever came from an animal, a week later we can make it even better. And this is just the way this is, the advantage of a technology shift. You can say that a parallel would be in transportation. The first mechanized transportation system famously lost a race to a horse. Okay, it was a locomotive, and in 1835, I think.
Doomed.
But the point is, it never lost again, because the horse never got any faster. And you switch to a technology platform that gives you the ability to optimize every important feature of it, and continue to optimize it. And that's what we've done, is that, if we identify some flavor component that we think makes our product better, we can dial it in immediately.
Right.
Or find a way to make the texture juicy or whatever is desirable there. And that's a huge advantage. And also the economics and the nutritional profile and so forth. So, we don't have cholesterol, we have lower saturated fat, we have actually slightly higher quality protein in terms of essential amino acids, and a whole bunch of things that consumers care about.
Right. In addition to all the geniuses and PhDs that you have on your R&D team, do you bring in people that are expert in taste, kind of like how a fragrance company have these people with these special noses that can smell things that ordinary people can't? Like, how do you evaluate taste in a scientific way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's also a really complicated question. So for one thing, everybody has their own notion of what the, ideal burger tastes like or the ideal steak tastes like and so forth. So there's not like an agreed upon target. That's just something important to keep in mind, because our goal is not to perfectly match the cow version. It's to outperform it in flavor and everything that consumers care about. And we have people who are trained tasters that can give us, and the trained tasting is not only kind of like they've trained their ability to discriminate particular features, in a food product, in this case meat, but also they've been trained on a particular vocabulary for communicating them, because that's almost equally important. Is that you can't just make up your own random metaphors or something like that. It's not useful, and it gives you a way then you can more objectively measure your progress in a particular direction. So we do use trained testers. We also rely heavily on testing where we get 100 or 200 just random consumers who are meat-eating consumers from the world, and we ask them to rate our each version that we're trying out on flavor and texture and appearance and overall likability and so forth, because that's also very important.
Yeah.
In other words, we're not trying to please these highly trained tasters. We want to please as many consumers as possible. So that's really important. And then we also use analytical instruments that give us very quantitative and objective measurements of sort of the chemical composition of the aroma and flavor, and where we've annotated a lot of the compounds based on their how they smell and what they contribute and so forth. And that enables us, it's more agile than bringing 100 people together in a room to test, a bunch of prototypes that you're looking at. It's no substitute, but it kind of gives you a surrogate measure to tell you if you're going in a good direction.
Yeah. In addition to Heme, what have you discovered that people deem to be the most important aspect of what makes a burger a burger? Like when you poll these people and, try to learn, what's working and what's not working, what is it that people come back to you and say? Is it texture? Is it aroma? Is it the aftertaste? Like how have you iterated on that kind of feedback?
Yeah. Well, the thing is that it's almost not that useful to figure out which is the most important, because they're all important, and unless you do a good job on all of them, people will be dissatisfied with it. But yeah, the flavor, the aroma, during cooking, the texture, the specifics of the texture, the chewiness, the juiciness, the appearance is really important. I would say and we're constantly optimizing all of them. My own view about which one is the most important, it just changes all the time based on what we're focusing on. But I think, if the color were off and the flavor and texture were good, it wouldn't win the competition with the cow.
Yeah.
If the flavor and color were good but the texture was mushy, we wouldn't win. If we didn't nail the flavor, if it didn't have the right meaty aftertaste,
you have to fire on all cylinders. And it's interesting to think, like, it's really important what the room smells like when you walk into the kitchen and somebody's cooking. It's not just what it tastes like in your mouth. It is the entire 360-degree experience of working with this product.
One thing that so early on, when we were just getting ready to commercialize it, we were giving samples of our product to a lot of chefs, okay, that, were kind of meat gurus. And a recurring thing that would happen is they would cook with it and they would say, this just blows my mind, okay? Why would that be? It's because there's something magical that happens when you cook meat. And it's a big part of, I think, the pleasure that chefs get with it. There's this transformation of flavor. There's an explosion of aroma. It's something that you never get with a veggie burger or a plant-based product or anything like that. So it's kind of like
it's mystical and magical.
It's a magical experience, I think, and the language that people and chefs use when they do it, it's very commonly. I mean, literally, it's like, this blows my mind. I've heard that multiple times, and you need to blow people's mind because meat, the behavior of meat when it cooks, it's just basic chemistry, but it's magical in the sense that this transformation happens. You can also, it's also the fact that you have to be able to cook it to your liking. Again, something you can't do with veggie burgers. So we had to have, the only thing that mattered for our product is that it has to deliver for meat lovers. We don't care about anyone else. Like, I'm vegan, many people I love are entirely plant-based, but we don't care about them from a consumer standpoint. It's all about delivering for the meat lover. And we can't kid ourselves. We have to deliver what they care about. And the experience of cooking is a big part of it, and the versatility. So they may want to serve it as tartare. Well, it has to behave as tartare. It has to have that raw meat taste as tartare. They may like it to cook their burgers very rare. Well, it has to not only look, but the texture and the juiciness and the flavor has to match a rare burger. And if it's well done, it has to match a well-done burger. And you're not going to solve that by making a kind of a pre-concocted product that tastes like a cooked burger but doesn't have the magic. And the only way you get the magic is by understanding the kind of biochemistry, the underlying beef flavor, and delivering it. And one of the neat side effects of that is, when you understand how meat works as a system, the problem of producing delicious meaty flavor gets simpler. You don't have to kind of like take the hundreds of molecules that make up the aroma profile of meat and figure out a way to cram them into a product. You just need simple amino acids, just simple biomolecules. They're not only simple, but they're abundant and cheap, okay? Unlike the fake flavors that go into a lot of veggie burgers. Just simple amino acids, vitamins, simple sugars, unsaturated fats, and a catalyst, bang, you get the magic. You get all those flavors for free. And
you make it sound so easy.
Well, it's actually an interesting thing that you often find when you try to understand in a fundamental way a system. It goes from, like, it's got thousands of things going on and complicated properties, but then it turns out that the underlying magic is relatively simple. And it goes from being, a big hairy problem, like the problem of how do we make a food that delivers everything that meat lovers care about and does a better job of it than the cow. Seems kind of like a big hairy problem. And conceivably it could have turned out to be a big hairy problem. But very often what happens is when you get down to the fundamentals and you really know how the system works, it gets much simpler.
Yeah. Well, that's something that I stumbled across in preparing to speak to you today, which is that it's easy to think of Impossible Foods as just the Impossible Burger, but in reality, your company the value of your company is in this database that you've created through the result of all this science that you put into it, that is really drilled down into how to make all these different flavors using plants as a source, right? That you can then, extrapolate on to make all different kinds of beef products and chicken products and ultimately fish and dairy and the rest, right?
Well, first of all, the way I define the value of the company is our ability to achieve our mission. I mean, we're serious. By 2035, we want to have essentially eliminated the use of animals as food technology by beating them in the marketplace and outperforming for consumers, okay? And that really does come down to building the know-how so that you have the capability of producing enough of the products that meat lovers crave and making them better than the corresponding animal-derived product, that you can win in the marketplace and succeed. And yes, a lot of what puts us in a position to be able to do this is, well, I would say pretty much most of it is just the knowledge that we've been accumulating. And, we're almost doubling our R&D team size because we're not kidding ourselves, okay? There's still a lot of hard problems to solve ahead. We've figured out a lot of things about, all kinds of meat flavors, fish flavor, how to control texture and juiciness and stuff like that. But we're not at a point where every meat lover is basically saying, I'm never going to eat anything but an Impossible Burger.
Right.
And, although plenty of them do, but until we get to that point, we're not done. And we have to be able to get better at flavor, at aroma, at juiciness, at texture. And also another very important thing is that we have to beat the incumbent products on cost.
Yeah. But that comes with scale.
It comes with scale, but it doesn't come automatically with scale. You have to have a system that asymptotically is much less expensive, and then with scale, you win there.
Yeah.
But you have to make the right choices. You have to have ingredients that are inherently scalable. You have and where the economics of those ingredients work out. And that's something that we spend a lot of time on. It's also really important for food security. I mean, part of our goal is to improve global food security by basically making, right now meat is one of the most important sources of protein and iron in the global diet. Protein deficiency and iron deficiency are probably the two most common nutritional deficiencies in the world. There's almost 1 billion people who are protein deficient, almost 2 billion people who are iron deficient in the world, mostly in
the developing
the poorer
world.
Parts around the equator. And that's a huge problem. And making a product that, American consumers will buy doesn't solve the problem for them. So, and asymptotically, so the ingredients that we've chosen now, based on their underlying economics, we should be able to be much cheaper when we're at scale.
Right.
And I think that's incredibly important, even in the developed world, because consumers are price sensitive. If we have a product that delivers on flavor, outperforms in flavor, nutrition, and it's cheaper, it's game over.
Right.
And so all of those are important goals. And we see many ways to improve on all those axes, going forward with our research. And also because the other reason that we've built this big team is that we don't want to do it methodically over a long period of time. We want to solve a lot of problems fast and in parallel, and that have to do with every aspect of making the product better, the products better, and be able to launch a bunch of new products. We're, one of the things that over the next couple of years we're going to really build up is work on a whole bunch of other products that we want to launch, in the next few years.
Yeah, there's been some press about the fish.
Yeah, fish for sure. I mean, fish, I would say in terms of environmental impact, you can debate it, but I would say beef is number one. overwhelmingly the land footprint of animal agriculture is cows.
Yeah.
Like I said, they outweigh every remaining wild animal on Earth by a factor of 10. And but fish, I would say, is probably a close second, because the global fish populations are down by half. The demand still outweighs the ability of the population to kind of reproduce themselves, and so that's a really urgent problem to solve. And we're working on it. And we've made a huge amount of progress on fish flavor. We are going to be working over the next couple of years hard on getting textures right, because there's different textural properties of fish tissues, and that's going to be really important.
You've made some really interesting choices as a brand in terms of how you've launched this product and introduced it to the public. And there are similarities in the way, for example, Tesla began by having this aspirational, very high-end product that created a bunch of demand, and then slowly over time building scale around it to create products that are more affordable. And I thought it was fascinating that you mentioned earlier introducing the product to some of these high-end chefs, like David Chang being probably the most prominent of them, to get it into the hands of these people that we kind of revere culturally, who are tastemakers and are influencing culture in a pretty in a substantial way, to get them on board and then get everyone talking about what's happening, which is very different from, we have this product, like, let's get it into grocery stores as soon as possible and make it as affordable as possible to everybody. So walk me through the thinking behind how you've positioned the branding of this and how you're introducing this to the public.
Okay, so I would say when we launched, and still today, the most important thing we get from every sale of our product is awareness of our brand and a change in psychology that plant-based products don't suck as meat. The biggest obstacle that we saw to our success is that every meat eater has a very strong, and this is true now, very strong preconceived notion that it is not possible to make a plant-based product that delivers what they crave from meat. And that meant that the most important thing we need to accomplish with each sale is to maximally send the message that this is something that, if you're a meat lover, you will actually like to eat. And so the most effective way to send that message is if someone whose livelihood and reputation depends on serving their consumers great food, and great meat in particular, because the chefs that we were particularly working with are people who are particularly revered as meat chefs. Okay, Dave Chang famously a few years ago banned vegetarian items from his menu.
Right.
Okay, he's a meat god, and those are the people that we wanted to work with. And if he's willing deliberately on his own to put something on his menu and sell it as meat in a meat application, that's hugely valuable as an endorsement to us. And when we launched, we had very limited production capacity. Our entire, factory, so to speak, was probably not much bigger than your garage. And so we had a very small supply, and we wanted to get the maximal bang for the buck out of every sale. I think it was probably, I don't really know the history behind Tesla's, go-to-market approach, but I think it was probably similar in the sense that they had limited production capacity, and the most important thing they needed to achieve with every sale was not the pittance of money that they get from the sale. It's the brand building value
and creating an experience that exceeds all expectations.
Exactly. And then when we were able to increase our capacity, we've still focused on food service, because it is I would say a much more on a per sale basis, much more effective way of exposing consumers to our product.
Right.
For one thing, the restaurant has a stake in curating the experience and making sure that the way it's presented to you is delicious, okay? And the way a sleepy, overworked person coming home and slapping something on their in a pan isn't necessarily going to be able to do. So we wanted people's first experience, ideally, to be in a situation where someone's done a good job preparing it. The other thing is that you're more likely to be eating in a group if you're in a restaurant. At least most people are. So more people can get exposed to it by sharing, and the restaurant is doing more to advocate for the produit than a grocery store.
Yeah.
In a grocery store, there's 50,000 things on the shelves.
That's a good point.
So anyway, it was, I think, a very sensible strategy, and we haven't done the control, but I think it worked.
No, I think it had.
Well.
I think it was a brilliant strategy, and kind of in line with that, you guys have always made sure to protect the Impossible brand within the context of the restaurant. Like they're not serving their, they can call it whatever they want. They sort of have to use the word impossible in it, right? Like whether you're at Umami Burger or Burger King, it's the Impossible Whopper, right? So to kind of keep that foothold.
It's interesting though, because what happened was from a very early stage, we established, at least within the restaurant and kind of food hyper-aware community, Impossible as a very strong brand. Most of the world and most of the U.S. still hasn't heard of it, okay? But what that means is that they get value from it, that it means something to a consumer that this is an Impossible burger and not just some random veggie patty. So we have no power over them. So most of our sales basically are just a restaurant decides they want to put it on their menu. They buy it from a distributor. Uh-huh. We can't compel them to do anything.
So you're not contractually obligating them to use your name.
No, but the thing is, it's greatly to their advantage. It's like, if you go to a restaurant and basically they sell beer, full stop, or wine, or some no-name coffee or whatever. You don't expect it to be as good, and you probably won't pay as much for it. If it's got a brand that means something, it's more desirable to consumers. So we don't have to compel the restaurateurs to do it, and we can't, and we don't. But they see the same value to it. They lose all the value of the brand that we've been building if they just put it on there anonymously.
Yeah, I mean, we've all had the experience of going into random restaurant X, Y, or Z, and you order the veggie burger or the veggie patty, and it's some nondescript, hockey puck kind of thing, versus, they have the Impossible burger, and this is something that you can only get in a few places, which kind of increases intrigue and consequently demand.
Yeah. So anyway, we've been. I mean. We put a lot of effort into how we launched to really focus early on, not on generating revenue, but generating positive brand awareness and so forth. And that has created the incentive for restaurants to put it on the menu as a branded product, which kind of becomes a positive feedback loop. Mm-hmm. And it's going to help us when we launch in retail because, at least a lot of consumers who've had our products in restaurants and or know about it and recognize it as a meaningful brand and something that they like will seek it out in grocery stores in a way that if it was just some whatever generic thing, it would be the best thing in the meat department, but but there'd be no way of people particularly know that.
Yeah. Well, the gradual rollout, I think it definitely has fed into intrigue and interest in what you guys are doing. I remember when you could I think Umami Burger was the only place in LA where you could get it, except for Crossroads or maybe one or two other high-end
I think
restaurants.
Those were the first two
right.
in LA, yeah.
And now slowly, it's becoming, it's not ubiquitous yet, but you're seeing more and more places. You guys have raised $750 million, something like that to date. And you're now in how many restaurants? 9,000, 10,000?
I would say it's either 10,000 or approaching 10,000. And by the time this is out, we'll be in National and Burger King. They have about 8,000 restaurants. So add about 8,000 to how many we're in now.
Wow.
And then we have other...
You have White Castle.
We have White Castle. We have Red Robin. We have a lot of other really great burger chains. Fat Burger in the LA area. Umami Burger.
And you're doing like a sausage product with Little Caesars also?
Yes. So we have actually an amazingly delicious sausage product that... it's people are crazy about it, and we did our first kind of test launch with Little Caesars. We're talking to quite a number of other customers about launching it in various form factors on pizza or as a breakfast patty or things like that, and it really is incredibly good.
Wow,
you got to try it.
I haven't tried that yet.
Yeah.
So here we are. I presume that Burger King then becomes your biggest customer. They have to be, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And they're huge internationally, right? So I would imagine there's plans for, I don't know if you can speak to that, but ultimately some kind of international rollout with them. Meanwhile, you have, Beyond Meat aligning with Carl's Jr., and you're seeing this kind of coalescing of the fast food industry, kind of canvassing what's available in the plant-based meat sector. It's undeniable that this is a growing trend. It's only going to continue to grow. I mean, there's varying reports on what the market cap is here, but it's in the, I don't know, $600 billion or something like that. They're projecting in the next decade. Oh. So it's not going away.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I probably have that wrong.
We'll be able to pay
I came
our
across
bills.
some crazy numbers.
Well, I think that there is one number that's worth keeping in mind is that right now, the global market for foods made using animals is about $1.5 trillion. And by 2030, it's projected to be a $3 trillion global market. So there's plenty of money to sustain this industry. And that's important because, we need to scale fast.
Yeah.
And scaling fast, basically you have to spend ahead of your growth to grow production and every supply chain, et cetera. So this is why this is why we've raised a bunch of money because you need that for being able to scale. But I think the thing that we're just at the beginning of what I think will be just a continuing and probably accelerating surge toward plant-based products replacing animal-derived products. And there's so many interesting things behind that. First of all, the reason that it's kind of been just a totally marginalized thing until very recently is, to be frank, the products from a meat eater's perspective just totally sucked. And this is even true of dairy products and other stuff, is that they're just not there yet. But they will. They're getting better all the time. There's a lot happening, to make these products not just incrementally better, but vastly better. Consumers' perceptions are correspondingly changing from thinking, okay, it's a plant-based product, I'm not even going to try it because it's going to be terrible. We actually, you should watch this. There's this radio show. I don't even know what it is because I've never actually watched it, but someone sent me the link of this guy, Glenn Beck. He's a right-wing pundit kind of guy. His producer kind of pranked him and his sidekick by giving him Hop Dottie is one of the chains that sells our product in Texas. They're very big in Texas. A very good chain, actually. Make great burgers. And gave him 2 Hop Dotty burgers. One was made with the cow, the other was made with the Impossible Patty, and gave him a blind taste test and asked him, okay, which is which? And he and a sidekick kicked it around, and eventually they said, well, this is a pretty good try, but this is clearly the one made from the cow. And that was the Impossible Burger.
You got it wrong.
and then he was kind of carrying on because he's a rancher. He's a Texas rancher, and raises his own beef cattle and stuff like that, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, the point is those kinds of things, where people who are absolutely uncompromising meat lovers are basically realizing that this is actually really good as meat, and it's getting better. I think there's a positive feedback loop here. And we also learned something really interesting in talking to meat lovers. They don't love the fact that their meat comes from animals. This is a really important point. Meat lovers love their meat because it's delicious, good source of protein and iron, convenient, affordable, in spite of the fact that it's made from the cadaver of an animal. Meat lovers almost universally, it doesn't matter where in the country or the world, do not consider the fact that this is made from the cadaver of an animal to be part of the value proposition. Mm-hmm. It's actually a negative. It's not enough of a negative to outweigh all the positives of the sensory pleasure they get from it. But what it means is that if you focus on, in plant-based products, delivering the things that are important to consumers, deliciousness being overwhelmingly the number one, but nutritional value and affordability, you win. You're not at a disadvantage, you're at an advantage.
I think that's right, although I would say that there is a caveat to that, which is, I don't know how large this sector of the population is, but there is a swath of people who have an emotional connection to the meat that they eat, and it's infused with like gender politics, what it means to be a man and be masculine, and that has a lot to do with meat. Even if they're getting it at the grocery store, they're barbecuing it at home, and there's something about that emotionally or sociologically that I think still needs to be redressed. I mean, ultimately, I think none of us like the fact that an animal has to die for our food, but there's still that thing.
I think that's much more fragile and superficial than people give it credit for. And 200 years ago, you could have said the same thing about the horse, right? I mean, even more so, because it wasn't just that it came from a cow in some farm 1,000 miles away, and you're somehow emotionally connected to that animal. In this case, basically, this is an animal that you live with every day, and you're taken care of and so forth, and is part of the household. And you would have said, wow, we have motor vehicles, but we got this emotional attachment to the horse, and it's going to be it took about a decade for the automobile to completely flip from 90% horses to 90% automobiles in households, because what they really cared about was not that the power in their transportation had 4 legs and a tail and ears. It was that it made the vehicle move. Right. And what meat consumers really care about ultimately is that it's as delicious as it can possibly be. It has the nutritional value they care about, and you can do what you want to do with it and so forth. I think that you deliver that, you outperform in the things that consumers care most about, and I think we'll find that association with an animal as a production system is not valued much, even by the hardest core meat lover. And the association with masculinity, I think that it's just something that's kind of in some societies sort of culturally programmed, and it can just as easily be, with cultural shifts, history.
Well, when you have a guy like Glenn Beck, that's huge for a certain sector of the population to see somebody like that, kind of get on board with it. And
I wouldn't say that he became our big supporter
But just the fact
he
that
he accidentally gave us a really good endorsement. Yeah.
And then there's the video of the people coming out of Burger King, and that I don't know if people have seen that. I'll link it up in the show notes. But these consumers who were convinced that they had just eaten a normal Whopper and were surprised to find out that
and regular Burger King Whopper loving customers, and that's really what it comes down to. Is you've got to give the consumer the pleasure and satisfaction that they need, and all those sorts of things, and it becomes a non-issue that this is made from plants. The reason it's a big issue is that people just think it cannot possibly deliver the things they value from meat if it's made from plants. But that is going to change a lot as consumers see more and more evidence that the most delicious meat in the world can come from plants.
Right. What about the argument that comes up that protein from animals is superior to the protein that you get in plants?
First of all, it's complete bullshit. And there's this is not something that has been ignored by scientists or anything like that. There's first of all, protein is a class of molecules made up of a string of amino acids. And from a nutritional standpoint, protein is just, it just depends on those amino acids, and particularly the essential amino acids and their relative proportions and so forth. That's what defines the nutritional value of a protein. There are lots of plant-based proteins that, from the standpoint of the proportion of essential amino acids, are better than beef, and that's simple and demonstrable. Even soy is one of them. Then people, a lot of meteorists think that there must be some kind of maybe it's not the protein, maybe it's something else, that magic ingredient in meat that you need for optimal health.
Right. IGF-1 or something like that. I mean, is the hormonal content?
You do not want more IGF-1. Yeah. I mean, if you look for what are the strongest markers of risk for a shorter life, IGF is one of them. But anyway, so the point is that here's the experiment that you should look at. There are people who have never had meat in their entire lives, including my 3 kids, maybe your kids. They're incredibly smart, excellent athletes. I think my son could beat you in a race, in a running race, and probably an uphill bike race too, because he's an incredible climber. I don't want to throw down the challenge because he hasn't been warned.
Well, I am 52, but all right.
Yeah, no, that's true too. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is, and I think this is a point that you try to make all the time, that there's no compromise in terms of your health and nutrition if you have no meat in your diet.
Right. Period.
It's demonstrably true. There are hundreds of millions of people that have never eaten meat in their lives, and they're thriving. They're successful professionally. They're successful athletes. They're incredibly smart. Nothing missing. So it's just a complete myth. And also, there's lots of reviews in the nutrition science literature that just systematically address all the evidence that not only a meatless diet, but an entirely plant-based diet is completely healthy at all stages of life.
Yeah, you don't have to sell me on that.
No, I know.
I'm with you, but I know that comes up, and it's like, yeah, I get it, but there's no protein like the protein that I'm getting in the animal.
Again, this is one of these myths that I think is propagated in part. We get some encouragement from the industry.
Yeah.
It's propagated in part by the desire to rationalize a strong taste for meat. I think that will vaporize very quickly when there are great plant-based products, when there's more and more evidence that people you respect for all the qualities that you value in yourself are eating an entirely plant-based diet, and we'll look back on it and just say, what were we thinking?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the industry a little bit, the big ag industry. From a legislative and regulatory viewpoint, there's some very interesting things that are happening right now. They are not going to go quietly into the night. So we have everything from, famously the ag-gag laws that are preventing consumers from truly understanding how these products are manufactured and packaged and how these animals are tended to and slaughtered, et cetera, to more recent iterations of protectionism in the form of, for example, this law that just passed in Mississippi that is, from my understanding, criminalizing labeling a veggie patty, a veggie burger, as a veggie burger. Mm-hmm. Or you can't even use the word veggie burger to describe your product. Mm-hmm. Do I have that right? And what is going on here?
Honestly, I don't know the details of the law, but you have it close enough.
The labeling law war here is super interesting.
I think it's a major part of the current strategy that the industry is trying to do to throw roadblocks in the way of plant-based meats.
And dairy
products, although I think that in a way that cow has left the barn, so to speak. But and I think that I expect those efforts to continue. I think that ultimately those laws will be found unconstitutional, and there'll certainly be some court battles over them. But I think it's not. If they wanted, look, if they said you have to call it something completely different, okay, you have to just make up a name that it makes no reference to meat. Well, people will not have any trouble figuring it out, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, it's preposterous that they would. The argument that it's confusing the consumers is just ridiculous.
No, of course it is. That's why I think it's not going to hold up to any kind of a legal challenge. But my point is that even in the, I would say, virtually inconceivable but exceedingly unlikely chance that these laws actually hang on, it's not going to stop. Consumers are not interested in our products and won't be interested in our products because of their name. If we have to educate consumers that this product, which we're calling amethyst or whatever, is actually identical in all the ways they care about to meat, only better, it'll be no problem. I mean, it'll just be kind of a minor short-term inconvenience. Call it what you want. It's sitting there in the meat case. You've seen, chefs cook it on TV. You've eaten it at barbecues. You know what it is. Okay.
What's the
big
problem?
Deal?
Right.
Yeah. People don't love beef because they love the name, right?
I never thought about that.
Yeah.
I guess that's true, right? Well, in order to actualize this mission that you're on, you have to reach tremendous scale, and you guys are working your way towards that. You've recently had kind of hockey stick growth that was almost, I would imagine, on some level maybe unexpected because you ran into some issues with meeting. The demand was so high, like you were having trouble even fulfilling on that, and so scale is I would imagine one of your huge focuses right now.
Sure. So, I mean, the fundamental problem that I think we learned a great lesson when the demand kind of surged. We were preparing to scale up production. We were already hiring for additional shifts at our production plant and designing additional production line and stuff like that. So we knew it was coming, but it just came much faster than we anticipated, and that was obviously a big problem, because the customers that are basically what we depend on for our whole mission, and have been incredibly loyal, and have in many cases taken a risk putting our product on their menu. Nothing is worse than if you're in the restaurant business, which is a kind of dicey business to begin with, and a consumer comes in for a product they know is on your menu and you're out of it.
You don't have it.
You lose that revenue. You lose also the revenue for all the other stuff that you would have sold with it. You've alienated a consumer, and so forth.
Trust and goodwill.
It's terrible, and I can just tell you, it doesn't do any good. We feel terrible about the fact that any of our restaurant customers suffered any consequences. We did everything we possibly could, which wasn't enough to try to get product to our customers while we were in this deficit situation, and then we just scrambled like wild to get out of it, including when we saw it coming. And also the thing about the food distribution system is that the demand signals take a while to filter back to you, because there's these two distribution nodes between you and the customer. So
there's a delay,
and then you start seeing that the distributors, your distributors running out, which means the downstream distributors have been running out, which means the restaurants and stuff like that. But anyway, when we saw this happening, I put out a call to everybody in our company that wasn't working in the factory, basically saying, we need volunteers. And what we're asking you to do, it's kind of like Shackleton's allegedly
all you scientists, you're going to have to go into the
basically we're asking you to volunteer to go across the bay, which isn't a terrible schlep, but it's an hour maybe, and work 12-hour shifts that either start or end at 3 a.m. at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, doing not the science that you signed up to do, but basically stacking burgers or doing something like that, so that we could add additional shifts and catch up to the demand. And within 24 hours, 100 people had signed up to volunteer to work in the plant. And, for a time, more than half of the people who were working there over the course of a week were basically from our R&D team, not the people we had hired for the production team. And then we just geared up hiring like mad. And we have to have a high standard for hiring because, we're producing food and it's no joke, So anyway, bottom line is we managed to kind of restaff 3 shifts now, 24-hour production with people with, experienced factory workers, people with experience in the food industry. And so now we're catching up. And in fact, we've replenished the distributors. And I think that we're not going to let that happen again.
Yeah.
But the fundamental problem is when you're growing, like more than 2-fold a year, like really, really growing super fast. The business of, you don't know for sure the slope. Some of the growth comes kind of not entirely predictably, like, we didn't know whether or when Burger King would sign on as a customer, and when they did, bang, it's a big thing. We, other big customers sign on. Well, we can't be producing that amount when there's no customer, but then we have to suddenly be producing that amount, so we need that agility. And we need to invest ahead of the growth, meaning we need to anticipate, we're going to be producing, the demand is going to be, several-fold greater in a year. And we have to make the investment in extra capacity, which, is quite a big bet. And since we are going to be doing this, every year, on average doubling every year from now until 2035 to achieve our mission, it's going to be this is going to be the challenge all the way along.
Right.
And what we've done is we've really changed the way we plan our business, which is very heavily focused on being prepared for a wide range of possible trajectories, so that we can be agile if the demand surges, and if the demand just stays as expected, we're ready for that. And if there's some reason that demand goes down, we're ready for that.
Yeah, it's a tricky equation because as you grow and scale, the ability to be agile becomes under threat, right? So the fact that you've got to be super protectionist about the R&D that you're doing and making sure that you have avenues in place where you can iterate and innovate quickly to respond, right?
Well, some of the responses don't require R&D innovation. They just require us to do a lot more of the same thing that we already know how to do very suddenly, like just scale the existing production. But the other thing you're alluding to, I think, is that we need to make products that can compete on an even playing field successfully against the products that have been on the market for 1,000 years and win on their merits.
Yeah.
And that's a high bar, and we need to do that for, all the categories of products that are made using animals in order to achieve our mission. And we're going to do it. I mean, I'm completely convinced. The more I know about what's required. No, the thing is that
because we are in an arms race, and there is a ticking clock here.
There is. No, 2035. We picked a time target because of the urgency of this, and of climate change and the meltdown in biodiversity and so forth. We can't just like you could say from a business standpoint, we could do the same thing with much lower risk by just kind of slow and steady growth and so forth. We can't. We have to take the risks to grow on the steep curve because that's our mission.
Yeah.
And from an R&D standpoint, we tell the team, okay, sometime in the next few years, we're going to have fish and chicken and pork and bacon and melty cheeses and all these different products that we've spent some time doing basic research on and so forth. But that's still quite a step from making a product that competes on an even playing field for a consumer, not just nice try. And that's why we're beefing up our R&D team. But the people who have been in this for a while, and the more you know about it, the more confident you are. Because you can see the space of possibilities, space of possible solutions. You know better what are the problems you need to solve and what's likely to be entailed in solving them before you've solved them completely. And but it's it's a big climb.
Yeah. It's got to be exciting, though. I mean, this trajectory that you've been on from academia to now sitting atop this $2 billion company and having, being responsible for hundreds of people has put you in a position where I would imagine you had to go on a crash course learning about leadership and management and all of these things that were not part of your professional experience prior.
Yeah, I mean,
what have you learned about how to run and build a company?
I mean,
yeah.
I haven't actually taken a course, and one thing I've learned, or one thing I did that I, in retrospect, I think was an important thing to do was recognize right away there's a whole bunch of things that I don't know how to do well, and I don't have time to learn how to do them.
So you get Dennis Woodside in.
So I get someone like Dennis.
Yeah.
And suddenly, I don't have to. I know this whole part of the company is in the best possible hands. When I first formed the company, I felt like, well, I don't know anything about the legal issues and the basic blocking and tackling of building a business. Okay, but I know where to find people who do. And I hired someone straight out of Stanford Business School, a very smart guy, who's still working at the company. He's head of our international growth. And he was basically responsible for doing all the basic, doing very well all the basic stuff of running a business and managing the finances and managing all the business operations. I know how to, kind of lead an R&D team. But one thing I hadn't done even there was, so my lab's research has always been very kind of like basic discovery-driven sort of research. it's a lot of the thought processes are similar, but when you're under time pressure, having to solve specific practical problems, okay, it's a different set of things. Like when we were first operating, I ran the R&D like an academic lab, basically, which was the only thing I really knew how to do. And but it was the right thing, I think, by and large, because mostly what we needed to do first was to study the problem and understand what we needed to do and do the kind of discovery research that is like what I used to do. When it morphed into, we need to still be doing all that, but now we're trying to figure out how do we extend shelf life and solve this packaging issue or whatever. It's got an R&D-ish component, but it's much more practical, and it's got time pressure, and that's something that I wasn't initially. That I was never in a position where the R&D team needed to do something on a timeline.
Yeah, because that's just not part of the academic experience.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's something that but fortunately, again, there are people who are good at that could both help educate me and bring that expertise there. In terms of leading a team, I mean, the thing is that the company is successful, I think, because the basic premise of the company is right, okay? And there's huge potential there. And I think if you hire great people, like literally, I would say the make or break thing you need to get right is to hire great people. And if you hire great people, then they want to hire other great people. And if you hire great people who are not just smart, but great, like they're kind, they're great collaborators, you can build a team and a culture that's incredibly strong, and without a lot of micromanaging by me can grow itself.
Right.
And
you attract those great people by having a huge mission and giving people interesting problems to work on.
That's it.
Yeah.
You can hire mediocre people by offering them a big bucket of money, but to hire great people, you have to give them a hugely important problem that's challenging, and that's what great people.
Right, and have them feel empowered, like they actually, have the agency to work on it.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
and this is for the people working at the company, their opportunity to be part of the most important. I really feel like our mission is the most important mission in the world right now, and arguably the most important mission in history, because the fate of the planet is in the balance, and we're not going to solve climate change or this biodiversity meltdown any other way. And actually, I'll just say one thing about climate change, even though you didn't ask me about it. But there's a very interesting aspect about the land footprint of animal agriculture, which is the opportunity cost in terms of climate change mitigation. People are talking about, here's this very complicated technology for carbon capture. Okay, there's a lot of work on carbon capture and so forth. Very capital intensive, very hard to imagine how it will ever scale. We have the most scalable, the most highly evolved carbon capture system in the world right at our disposal. And it's basically all it requires is land, water, and sunlight. Okay, and we got water and sunlight. 50% of Earth's land area is being used to raise animals for food. The amount of biomass on that land, and it's actually been research on this, represents about 17 years worth of fossil fuel emissions. Okay, meaning that if you could snap your fingers and make that industry go away, the recovery of biomass on that land, just without doing anything, will immediately start lowering atmospheric CO2 concentrations. You don't need fancy technology. You just need to kick the cows off the land, basically. And not at the same time, you're going to be solving this biodiversity meltdown, because it's all about habitat destruction and degradation. And if you just get the feed crops and the cows out of the equation, you basically get back about half of Earth's entire land area to capture carbon from the atmosphere automatically and rebuild healthy ecosystems. So
it's incredibly compelling, and it seems unassailable to me. But what I find interesting is, in the same way that big food, big ag will not go quietly into the night, and there's a couple more things I want to say about that. We're seeing this sort of small groundswell of people who are, adopting this carnivore diet, and it goes hand in hand in some respects, I guess loosely, with the regenerative agriculture movement, which I think there's a lot that's great about that. So I'm interested in how, you're shaking your head. I want to hear about this, like how what you're saying kind of squares with people who are trying to, reclaim what the farm is and can be as a means of regenerating the soil.
Okay, so I've spent a lot of time looking at the literature. I've dug into the data and so forth surrounding regenerative agriculture. It's a longer conversation, but what I can say is there's zero evidence. So what happens is that people are extrapolating from the wrong kinds of experiments to say the best thing we can do is put more cows on the land. Okay, if you take land that has been depleted by farming and you convert it to growing grass, how do you do that? Well, first of all, it involves putting a ton of fertilizer on the land. And then you have cows grazing on the grass. What has worked is putting fertilizer back into the soil, the depleted soil, and letting grass grow on it. They give the credit to the cows. There's zero evidence for that. Okay, so there's no. The
idea being the core idea being that the cows being on the land is what's regenerating the soil.
Right, and honestly, you just have to look into what the raw evidence is that's cited in favor of that. And there's lots of scientific literature on this in many ecosystems that have looked at whether this works, and there's just no evidence for it. The other thing is that the experiments are asking the wrong question, which is the question they're asking is this system, instead of growing soybeans or whatever was grown on the land, planting grass and putting cows on it, is it better from carbon capture standpoint than continuing to grow those crops? The real question is it better than a healthy ecosystem that would otherwise exist on that land and support biodiversity and store biomass not just in the soil but above ground? And like I say, this is one of these things where there are these claims being made that ecologists have no respect for, okay? But they're claims being made by people who are in that business. And they're just being repeated over and over again. And a lot of people just think, okay, well, I keep hearing about this, it must be a good thing. But the scientific foundation for it is essentially nil. Mm-hmm. And if you think that we'd be better off with, instead of having 10 times the total biomass of every wild vertebrate on Earth, 15 times, as cows, I mean, you're smoking crack. It's just a completely ridiculous idea. Now, the one thing I just want to say is there are people who are doing this. I'm not questioning their good intentions. A lot of people who are in the farming and ranching business, they care deeply about, protecting the planet and protecting the, taking care of the land they farm and so forth. So it's not a question of bad intentions. It's just a question of there's no data to support this.
Yeah. So this is something that I think was initially launched into mainstream awareness by Alan Savory. I believe he did a TED Talk on this. He has a lot of people that are following him. Mm-hmm. But on a very elementary level, when I look at it, I just can't get around the idea that it's incredibly land intensive. Like, it's not scalable. Like, we're not going to be able to feed 10 billion people on the planet in this way. There may be a place for a very high end, like the Joel Salatins, and people want to, spend a premium amount of money for meat. But in terms of feeding the planet, you need an unbelievable amount of land for these cattle to graze. And we're already at 50%, right? There isn't that much more land available. And where's the water coming from? Like, where I don't know that it accounts for everything, and maybe I'm missing something here, but it just doesn't seem to make sense as a solution that's going to work at scale for a quickly escalating population of people where we're already struggling to meet the demand.
Well, I think that you hit on the main thing, which is that, yes, it's incredibly land intensive. Forgetting about whether there's any evidence that this is better than,
even if you presume it is.
Virtually anything else. But here's the thing. If instead you allowed the original biomass that existed on that land before it was cleared for farming and grazing and stuff like that to recover, and there are lots of publications that address what happens when you take a land that's being used to raise cattle and you turn it into a national park or a state park and so forth. It actually can recover over a relatively short period of time a lot of its native flora and wildlife and so forth. But the amount of carbon that gets stored there, instead of just a little layer of grass that's being continually grazed and so forth, that you have, trees and tall grasses and all this biomass, that's how you pull carbon out of the atmosphere, not by having cows, tromp the grass into the soil.
Yeah.
And anyway, I don't even want to get it. This is one of these debates where it generates a lot of heat, and I'm always kind of, even though there's nothing to that,
I gotcha.
Agriculture thing.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too much into it because it alienates people who are trying to do the right thing, but the way that we achieve our mission is not by winning arguments. It's by focusing relentlessly on making the most delicious meat in the world and letting it speak for itself.
Right. On that subject, I think it's safe to say that Wall Street is paying attention. The Beyond Meat IPO was massive, and now we're seeing big players move in to the sector. We've got Nestle, Tyson, Purdue. All of these giant conglomerates are recognizing that this is the future, and they're stepping in to they're starting to enter your space here. So how do you think about that?
I honestly here's how I think about it. If someone who is a current meat eater decides that they would rather eat something made by Nestle or whomever, a plant-based product, my feeling is, congratulations, that's great. Keep eating that. We're going to go after the people who are not satisfied with that product because that's where the action is. Mm-hmm. And I think that it will be up to them to make a product that really reaches into the meat consumer market, which is the vastly greater than the veggie burger market, let's say. Uh-huh. And those consumers are not looking for another veggie burger. They're looking for meat.
Yeah,
that delivers what they get from meat.
Yeah. There's a big distinction there.
And so if those guys can come up with something that really performs for meat lovers, then my feeling is, thank you for doing this.
It feeds your mission.
Yes, exactly. What it does is the problem is something else, which is that if there's a lot of hype and the products don't deliver, which is kind of my concern, it reinforces the biggest obstacle to trial of our product, which is the strongly held notion that nothing made from plants can possibly be good as meat. And if a bunch of these big companies put a lot of hype behind a product that's basically just a glorified veggie burger,
makes your job harder.
It just makes our job harder.
Yeah.
But we are not interested in competing with them. That's the most important point, is that their success, we don't want their customers. Mm-hmm. We want the customers who are not satisfied with their product.
You're making a Maserati and they're going to churn out a Toyota Corolla.
I think it's more like a Tesla, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah. What's going on with McDonald's? Why are they like the last? All these fast food chains are getting on board here one by one. McDonald's seems to be biding their time here. Do you have any sense of what's going on with them?
I don't know what's going on in their heads. I think historically they move at a very deliberate pace in making any kinds of decisions. They're such a big, so big at scale. It for them, I think, the robustness of your supply chain is really important. They need to have guaranteed access for product at scale, at a very large scale, and so forth. So there's a lot of things that are a bigger deal for them than for almost anyone else. Well, Burger King is pretty close, but they're actually incredibly agile. They've really impressed me. They make decisions quickly. They make them well. They really do their homework. They're very analytical. And I think they recognize that this was a big opportunity that they wanted to get it right. They were very methodical in looking at the alternatives when they were deciding what to put a plant-based product on their menu. But once they did, they moved very quickly. Yeah.
One thing I need to ask you about is something you've been transparent about, which is that you use GMOs in your product. Mm-hmm. So how do you speak to that, or speak to the person who has wariness around, that issue, which is a sensitive issue for a lot of people?
I think the most important thing is we do speak to them about it, and we engage in any conversation, answer any questions they have about it. We are extremely candid, even to the point of, kind of being out there about making sure that people know that we have products in our ingredients in our product that are produced by genetic engineering. And what I found is that basically consumers, when they understand what's actually being done, and I've had probably 1,000 of these conversations where someone, has this concern, is there something I should be worried about? And if you just talk them through it and they understand exactly what we're talking about here and why we made this decision and why it's the best decision we could make, it's taken off the table as an issue. Now, I think there are some people for whom they're absolute fundamentalists. It's basically, it doesn't matter what the scientific evidence says, GMOs are bad inherently, and I'm not even interested in listening. But for most consumers, that's not the case. And the other thing to keep in mind is that products made by genetic engineering are ubiquitous in the food system. More than half of all the cheese in the U.S. is produced using rennet, which is normally an enzyme in the stomach of baby, cows. But it's actually produced by yeast that have been engineered with the cow gene for that protein. And that's been true for 25 years. Mm-hmm. And, a very large fraction of products made from grains are made from genetically engineered crops. If you drink sodas, that corn syrup comes from genetically engineered corn.
So the genetically engineered aspect of what you do has to do with the yeast, correct? Like, I just want to understand.
No, there's two components. So at first, we made the decision very long before we launched commercially that we would use genetic engineering to produce our heme protein because it was by far the safest, most scalable, economical way to produce it. And we needed it. It was the essential ingredient for meat. So that was a no-brainer. Recently, because of the surge in demand, basically, we had initially been using non-GMO soy.
Right.
Well, there wasn't enough non-GMO soy.
In order to scale, you had to pivot to GMO soy.
Yes. Now, is there a reason to be concerned about that? No, actually, there's not. The reason we were using non-GMO is because that was for the leg hemoglobin, we had no choice. That was the only way to produce it scalably and safely and affordably by genetically engineering yeast. There was this for the soy protein, we didn't need to use the GMO soy, and we felt like, well, we don't want to pick any fights we don't need to pick, so we'll just use the non-GMO soy that's existing on the market, and we don't need any additional controversy. But now we needed to scale up, and we needed the GMO soy. So the question is, and we have a blog post on this where you can read all the details, but we had actually, even before we made that decision, we looked hard at it in terms of what are the real issues. So in terms of, I think the reasons that people are concerned about, unless you're a GMO fundamentalist where you basically just feel like genetic engineering is bad, is the main genetic modification of soy is resistance to glyphosate.
Right.
And so the reasons for concern are, is this causing more glyphosate use with greater exposure in the environment or to workers and so forth to this herbicide? And are there residues on the food that would pose a health risk to the consumer? Okay, so the total amount of herbicides used on soy, the non-GMO soy gets treated just as heavily with herbicides, and actually more toxic herbicides than Roundup. It's not like the non-GMO soy doesn't get herbicides on it. Absolutely not. There's good data on that, and the total burden is very comparable, possibly greater than for the GMO soy. Second thing is, if you care about that issue, in our case, the question you should ask is, if I buy an Impossible Burger, will I be worsening or improving the problem to the extent it exists with herbicide use? Well, our herbicide footprint is about 10 times lower than the herbicide footprint of beef from a cow, because those animals are fed corn, soybeans, alfalfa, all these feed crops that are treated with herbicides, and in fact, a lot more of them than are soybeans. So from an environmental standpoint, you're way ahead. From a residue standpoint, the glyphosate residues, well, we've measured glyphosate. We're just going to have a blog on this, but we've measured the glyphosate residues in our product. Many times in our earlier version, we've done it since we switched to the GMO soy. We've measured twice. There's no detectable pesticide residues of any kind, with a detection limit that's like thousands of times lower than the dose at which there's any health risk.
Yeah,
thousands of times
that's good
lower.
to know. I mean, that would be my concern: is that am I ingesting glyphosate? And I do have some concerns about that. So, well,
I think it's legitimate to be concerned and aware of it. But I think the thing to consider is, for example, the detection limit of the assay we use. If it detected something, it's like I think a couple of hundred times below the level that's allowed in organic soybeans, okay? So there is, and by the way, one of the good reasons for doing what we're doing is reducing the herbicide, the pesticide footprint of the food system. So our pesticide footprint, so to speak, is like tenfold lower than the cow. Okay, so it's not that we're indifferent to it, but in terms of consumer exposure, a quite high fraction of organic foods have measurable levels of glyphosate, just because it's kind of ubiquitous, and but it's far below the level at which there's any toxic effects, like maybe 10,000 times below the level at which you could be exposed to it every single day for your entire life without any health consequences. So, again, I'm not advocating for the herbicides, but people freak out about these things when if they actually knew what the data said, they wouldn't worry.
Yeah, I got you. So good. Well, I'll link that initial blog post you mentioned
we
in the notes, and if there's another one, let me know, and I'll put that up there as well. Yeah. All right, cool. Well, I got to let you go here in a few minutes, but walk me through. Okay, it's 2035. We've eradicated cows on the planet. We have, introduced plant-based meats and meat alternatives and dairy alternatives to the global population. What does the world look like? Walk me through the successful vision of this mission.
So if we don't succeed, if it's business as usual, we are going to be in the basically late stages of biodiversity meltdown and, catastrophic climate change and so forth. If we achieve our mission, which we will be far along in restoring healthy ecosystems and that support biodiversity, because the 50% of Earth's land area that's being used to raise animals for food can recover its biomass and its wildlife and, biodiversity. Secondly, we will have turned back the clock on climate change. We'll have reduced ongoing emissions by at least 15%, and we'll have turned back the clock on climate change by at least 17 years. So how far in the future is 2035?
It's
less than 17 years.
Like 16 years.
So basically, we will have put a significant halt to progression of climate change. And these are, this may sound like hype, but you can just do the math. This is not, a made-up scenario. The recovery of biomass on the land that's being used for agriculture will pull 17 years worth of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere just by photosynthesis and growing the plants. And so I think we'll have a more livable planet. We'll have averted climate catastrophe. We'll have vastly reduced the demands on the water supply, water security, because it's like about a third of all water use. Waterways will have much less nutrient pollution. We won't have dead zones in river deltas, which is all due to agricultural runoff. And lower risk of foodborne illnesses, lower risk of influenza epidemic, because those influenza epidemics that are the biggest fear of public health professionals almost invariably start in poultry farms and or pig farms, and get rid of those farming situations, the risk of a new epidemic strain of influenza goes way down.
Also, the antibiotic intake of all the people that are eating these animal products, right?
The antibiotic. It's not the antibiotic intake, because you don't get much antibiotic residue from meat. The problem is that the massive amount of antibiotics that are being fed to livestock select in those animals bacteria, many of which can infect humans, that are resistant to those antibiotics.
So we're breeding the superbugs.
You're breeding superbugs. And so that is kind of like the system that is sort of like the optimal thing you could possibly do, create this huge culture of bacteria where you're selecting for antibiotic resistance on a massive scale. Yeah, you'll get rid of that.
Terrifying.
You'll reduce the risk of multi-drug resistant bacteria getting into the human population.
It's a pretty good list.
It's one of these things where, I mean, to me, it almost sounds ridiculous when you list all the advantages of it. Like, how could that possibly be? That, well, it's because we're so used to this system that we don't realize how catastrophically bad it is for public health, for the environment.
It's hard to telescope out and see it for what it is. It's almost like you have to be, if you were, I've said this before, but if you were an alien and you landed on planet Earth and you said, take me to the people who make these decisions about how you're making your food, and it was explained to them and they looked around, they'd say, you're insane.
Yeah. Well, the way I think about it is that, in 20 years, we, and particularly kids, will look back on what we're doing now and just think, how could you possibly have thought this was a reasonable thing to do? Like, what?
Yeah.
What? You were literally covering the planet with cows so you could kill them and eat them when you can just make better tasting, healthier, more nutritious food directly from plants. Like, what?
Yeah. I think that's a good place to end it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pat.
Okay. Thank you.
I appreciate it.
I'm talking to you.
Yeah.